Welcome to the Leadership Drip, coffee and conversations for leaders leading the next generation. We're excited to welcome another incredible guest to our table, but before we do, could you do us a favor and hit the subscribe button? And while you're at it, go ahead and give us a 5-star review. That helps these conversations reach other great leaders. Pour yourself a cup of coffee and get ready to join us at the table for another great episode of the Leadership Drip. Jeff, welcome back to Leadership Drip.
Well, welcome back. Yeah, your coffee today is hot.
My coffee, it is still decaffeinated.
Still decaffeinated. Yeah. Okay.
But we have a great show today, and I'm super excited about our guest. He's a writer, a speaker, a media producer. He's coming out of Burbank, California. He's helping leaders navigate their career, their calling, really in today's distracted, media-driven kind of culture, which is such a prevalent conversation.
Yeah.
When we start talking about digital Babylon, and that is Phil Cooke. And Phil, thank you for being on the show.
I'm thrilled to be here. Hello from Hollywood. This is a real honor. This will be fun.
It's been a minute, Rob, since we've had a SoCal guy on the show. Like there was a string where there was like 5 or 6 guests who I think were from Southern California. And I feel like that was a setup. Like you orchestrated that somehow.
Yeah. Then we got stuck in the Midwest somewhere with Chicagoland and
all the Californians are moving to the Midwest. That's what's happening right now.
That is what's happening
in Tennessee.
So actually, Phil is our second Hollywood guest. If you remember, we had Madeline Carroll. Do you know Madeline?
Yeah. Yeah.
So probably a year ago, we had Madeline on the show. She's doing great things. So, but you have a very interesting story because you have a PhD in theology. How does a guy with a PhD in theology end up in Hollywood?
Well, that's kind of weird. My dad was a pastor, and my dad had 2 PhDs, and I just grew up with a real love of learning. I've got a massive library. He had one. I've kind of followed in his footsteps, and I just love learning. I got my bachelor degree. Then 10 years later, I got my master's. Then 10 years later, I got my PhD. I just really like going to class. And so I chose theology because even though I was a producer, communication, when you get up to the PhD level, it's all research and formulas and modeling and just really weird stuff. And most of our clients and people we work with are Christian organizations, and I love theology. I always have. And I thought, let me go explore that. I had to do a little extra stuff on the side to catch up. But I actually did my doctoral dissertation on the movie The Shawshank Redemption, which freaked the doctoral committee out. But yeah, it was a great experience, and I'm thrilled that I did it.
The Shawshank is one of my top 10 movies.
It's a good one.
Yeah, terrific, really terrific. And my point with the movie was to say, hey, as Christians, we got to come up with a better way to evaluate movies than analyzing the number of cuss words or sex scenes or scenes of violence or things like that. And I said, Shawshank is a perfect example. It's got everything bad in it. It's got all that stuff in it. And yet it's a powerful, powerful, compelling movie. And it's really a redemption story. So that was kind of my example to say, it's time for us Christians to rethink how we analyze movies. That's a big thing, I think.
Yeah.
Well, 2 things. First of all, I'm really encouraged by the fact that you are doing what you're doing where you are and you're learning. So my wife asks me all the time, are you ever going to stop going to school? And I said, probably not. Like,
yeah,
right.
Rob is in the process of finishing his dissertation.
I'm in dissertation mode right now. So hopefully
excellent.
September 1st is my deadline. So hopefully I can get the draft in by then. But the point is, that was the first point. The second point is, I think this conversation that you've kind of initiated here with the redemption piece of different kinds of media or different kinds or expressions of art, I think is really a conversation that the church have not handled as well possibly as we could have. But I think that is changing, especially with this generation. So this course that I'm teaching right now that I'm getting ready to close up for the summer is called Becoming More Than Christian, based off a book by Addison Bevere. But the point is, how are you seeing this kind of evolve in your world, which is traditionally well outside of the church paradigm? Like, how are you living, or how are you seeing other believers in your world become more than just the cultural term Christian?
Well, it's a good point. And I tell, it's funny. I tell young people who are coming to Hollywood, if they want to be a director, producer, actor, whatever, lead with your talent, not with your faith. So often we have kids that will come out to Hollywood, and some of them are quite talented, but the first thing they do is tell a producer, look, God called me to Hollywood to change the industry. Or they'll go to a meeting at a studio or a network and say, God's called me here to change what you guys are doing. Well, they get laughed off the lot. They get kicked out of the building. And so I've learned that if you go in with your talent first, and impress them. Let them know that you're a brilliant actor or producer or writer or director or whatever. Suddenly they embrace that and they're open to anything you have to say. I mean, everybody in town knows I'm a Christian, but because our team does really quality work, we still get hired for all kinds of projects, at places like DreamWorks or Disney or places like that. So I've just discovered Hollywood is not really anti-Christian. They're just fairly ignorant of all things Christian. They didn't grow up in a Christian home. Most high level people in the attorney business or any other bit in the business world, they didn't either. And so we just have to understand that if we can speak their language, impress them, make them understand that we're really good at what we do, that gets their attention. And what's happened is there are hundreds of dedicated Christians in all kinds of levels here in Hollywood making an impact. And it's really a remarkable thing to see.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting point about the doing things with excellence, because I feel like the Christian media and media in all the art forms, film, music, even in photography, has been less than excellent. There's always sort of a tinge of Christianese attached to it, and it doesn't make the mark. What was the driving force for you to go, hey, we're not just going to make good Christian art, we're going to make art that is on the same level as Hollywood or on the same level as Nashville or wherever the context is? What was the driving force for that level of excellence?
Well, my family were big on movies. My dad, even though he was a pastor, he loved movies. Even back when he was ministering in the 50s and 60s and 70s, he loved movies. So I grew up going to films and seeing them. And my dad didn't know a lot about them, but he understood their power. And I got to see some really powerful movies. And I got involved in the independent filmmaking movement back in the 70s and 80s. Mm-hmm. So you start seeing what works and what doesn't. And I just have a natural allergic reaction to cheese. I just hate cheesy movies and cornball scenes and acting and things like that. And you're right. I think a lot of it, particularly when we talk about Christian media, a lot of it stems from the fact that the pioneers of Christian media, radio and TV, certainly back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, were not producers or writers or creative people. They were preachers. They were pastors and preachers and teachers. And so the Billy Grahams, the Fulton Sheens, the Oral Roberts types, they embraced media early. Now, they knew what they were teaching and they were great speakers, but they didn't know anything about how to package a program. So for many, many years, guys like that just were out there. They had a passion to share the gospel, but they just really didn't know how to do it in a really great way. And so what I've seen over the years since then is a new generation of creative leaders are stepping in who understand the importance of producing and directing and writing, lighting a scene, for instance, and really making something that works. So while we continue to see bad movies put out by Christians, keep in mind, we also see really bad movies put out by Hollywood every year.
Yeah, that's true.
We still see that. However, I'm incredibly encouraged that we're seeing more and more really high quality work by Christians in the industry. I have one friend who's a strong Christian guy, but he directs horror movies and he's got a whole theology of why Christians should be doing horror movies. And it's really kind of funny. He said, in most movies today, the hero is in a real gray area. You don't know, it's not a black and white thing anymore. You don't know if he's good or bad or what. He said in horror movies, you always know who the good guys are. You always know who the bad guys are. And the bad guy always gets what's coming to him in the end. He said, from a theological framework, it's a much better model. So he's out there doing those kind of movies. So it's just interesting, the number of Christians out here trying to speak the language of the culture in different ways. And it's just getting better and better, I think.
I'm going to set you up, Phil, because I have a question about something that's being produced right now, which I think is excellent in The Chosen. The Jenkins were actually Dallas was in high school with me, which is the retelling of, if those of you who have not watched The Chosen, it's kind of the retelling of Jesus and the disciples from the disciples' point of view. But it's some of the best Christian art I think we've had in a long time. So
I've heard that from a lot of places, by the way.
So what is your take on something that's being crowdfunded like The Chosen?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a number of things. First of all, I'm really proud of Dallas and what he's done. That was a remarkable thing. It was a brilliant idea. And I think it was good. When I first heard about it, I thought, oh, the last thing we need is another movie on the life of Jesus. I mean, come on, how many do we have to have? And, but it's really quite brilliantly done. Now, I think the crowdfunding model is kind of a one-off. I don't see that happening a lot. So, I hope people aren't rushing out to do a crowdfunding film and expecting that kind of result, but he'd been planning this for a very long time. And I think that's a real key. Strategy matters. I've worked with a number of ministries over the years that their media team was super creative, but that's all they thought about. There wasn't creativity for a purpose. It wasn't creativity to try to impact somebody. I think what Dallas has done is really bring strategy to the table and think this through and look at the result. It's really quite amazing. So I'm really excited for what he's done and super excited about his success. I think it's just a really remarkable thing.
Yeah, it's not his first movie either. Like
No.
our first project. I've watched some early Dallas Jenkins. Well,
he admits some of the early
Dallas
Jenkins was.
Some was great though. But it was cheesy Christian films in some regards. So
we all have skeletons in our creative closets. Trust me.
Yeah. As preachers, we have some bad ones too. So. Lots of them.
So here's an interesting kind of conversation that I've been having recently too. There's been this there's a transientness and a contextualization to things that used to be bad that are now good. So for example, at this institution years ago, decades ago, going to the movies was a bad thing, right? That was a rule. But now we have a full length feature film major that you can actually do these kinds of things for a living, right? So there's a transientness to these types of conversations, which I think is good. So from your perspective, kind of looking forward, is there a contextualization or transientness to anything that you see happening next that may not necessarily be acceptable or kosher at the moment?
Yeah. It's funny. I totally get it. I went to Oral Roberts University back in the early 70s, and we weren't allowed there was no dancing allowed on campus. And if we wanted to organize a dance or something, we had to do it off campus. Today, ORU has a dancing major. They have a dance major. And so it's really come full circle in that respect. And I think you're right. One of the things I've been involved in, my wife, Kathleen, and I got involved early on with Biola University here in LA, taking a group of students to the Sundance Film Festival. Now, the Sundance Film Festival is probably as liberal a film festival as you can ever imagine. I mean, it politically, on the political spectrum, it is ragingly liberal out there and very anti anything religious. But yet it started with about 10 or 15 film students, and then it's grown. We've invited other colleges and other universities now join the group every year, and it's gone up to about 70 or 80 students. And they basically interact with the filmmakers during the day, and then they go see films every evening. And then the next day they go interact with the filmmakers that made the films they saw. And the conversations that have just happened there, I just realized would have never happened 20 years ago at a Christian college. They're confronting issues and things and the way the culture thinks. They're seeing stuff they would never, ever see at a Christian kind of environment. So it's been really good. And at the same time, it's exposed Sundance people, particularly the creative crowd at Sundance, to these Christian college students. And what's really funny is we become the single biggest block ticket buyers to the Sundance Film Festival. This group of Christian college filmmaking students are now the biggest block ticket buyers to Sundance, and they roll out the red carpet for them. And it's just really interesting. So to see Christian filmmaking students, Christian college students engaging with people at this level in the industry, that's just a remarkable, remarkable thing. And so who knows what's going to be open. Obviously, I've got my PhD in theology, so I'm really aware of lines we don't want to cross theologically and biblically. But at the same time, so much of what's held the church back has been cultural issues, not biblical issues. We've decided you can't smoke, you can't dance, you can't see movies and all these things. And that's just not a biblical issue. So I think as we've tried to get rid of all those things and rethink how we engage the culture, it's helped us get a lot more credibility out there.
Yeah.
So from a theological perspective, and I agree with everything you're saying, but from a theological perspective, we have to not only have sort of a culture shift in the Western American Christian context in terms of good or bad, right or wrong, what's acceptable or not acceptable, right? That's a whole different conversation. Also, I'm a Biola grad, and I know they have a fantastic program there, but also from a theological perspective, it's not that we should just be tiptoeing into these areas or these arenas, whether it be film or business or whatever. We actually should be the ones sort of leading the charge. The creator of heaven and earth, the same spirit lives within us that raised Jesus from the dead, right? That's theologically,
yes,
right?
Totally
dominating these arenas. So how do you see us begin to actually not only just navigate or step into these arenas, but begin to actually to lead the charge in creativity and conversation in these arenas?
Yeah, you're right. It's interesting that in the very first verse of the Bible, God chose to introduce himself as a creator.
Yeah.
And yet we just don't value that in so many places. And throughout history, the church was the leader in the creative world. I oddly enough, I'm going to tell you something weird, and that's oddly enough, COVID has really helped this because I'll tell you, hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of churches would be out of business today if it wasn't for the creative team during that shutdown. We've spent years working with churches and ministry organizations, helping them with live streaming. And when the shutdown happened, suddenly we just got flooded with phone calls from churches needing advice. And what do we do? And how do we maximize our live stream? How do we make it work? And I just really got to see that communication and media people, the creative team at churches, were keeping that church alive because they were working overtime, getting live streams out, helping with social media, doing these other things. And what I've seen is a huge renaissance in the perception pastors have for their creative team. In fact, it's funny, over the last maybe 6 or 8 months, I've spent more time teaching when I do conferences and events, even some on Zoom. I've done them all over with people all over the world. I've started teaching more and more about how to lead creative teams, because I'll tell you, as you know, in seminary, they don't teach you about communication or media. And most pastors just have no idea how to work with that graphic designer, that video person, that webmaster, how to deal with those people. So I just see pastors suddenly, as a result of COVID and the shutdown, have had so much more of an appreciation of their creative team, and they've really brought them to the table. I was at a meeting in a large church in New Orleans just last week, and it was about the creative team. They were the voices that were really having the most influence on the pastor in the church because he's recognized what's happened over the last year. So I hope that continues because I'm telling people, you know what, COVID has forever changed the way we do church. And I'm telling people not to take your foot off the gas when it comes to your live stream at your church. We need to keep that going. But I hope it's changed the way pastors have viewed creativity, communication, media, all those things, because I think it's really critical that they understand how that works.
So Phil, and how as leaders, so I think we're shifting, and we saw that in the COVID. We've talked to lots of pastors who that became their primary focus. How do we get online? How do we get our messages more than just content online? How do we be present online?
Yeah.
But as Christian leaders, because that's the primary audience we have, how are we maybe to personally engage, or even as a brand, a lot of times a pastor becomes engaged online?
Well, I could write a book about, I have written a book about that actually, and I could teach for hours on that subject. It's a big topic, but I think the important thing is understand that today, and the biggest pushback we get against social media and connecting online from pastors, particularly older pastors, is yes, but we need the fellowship. We need the real fellowship. Well, I'll tell you, talk to anybody under 35 years old, and fellowship happens online. It's not, it's not such a big deal that they're physically together. And so, first of all, pastors need to understand the way this generation thinks about the online world. For the first time, I think Generation Z, the kids who are in college in their 20s right now, keep in mind, this is a generation that doesn't know anything about not having an iPhone. They don't know anything about not being online. They are totally a digital generation. And so how we engage with them really, really does matter. And so I've been telling pastors throughout the shutdown, it's not just about your live stream. That's the start. That's important. That's just the start. Right. How you're connecting during the week through Instagram video, Facebook videos, all kind of social media platforms really does matter. And I think that if pastors aren't willing to try that, I was thinking the other day, it would be like if a pastor 20 years ago said, I just don't do books. I'm sorry, but I'm just not a book person. That would be ridiculous to be a pastor and not be into books. Today, I just think the same feeling about social media. If you're a pastor and you're not engaged in some way, and granted, if you're an older pastor, I get it. That's kind of out of your sphere. I don't have a problem with that, except I would encourage you to dip your toe in the water and at least try it. But I've just seen remarkable things happen on social media over the years. And I just think it's too important. I've said many times when I talk that by population, the largest country on the earth, on the planet now, is Facebook, which, but the question is, who's sending missionaries to that country? Who's planting churches in that country? If there was one thing I wish your listeners would walk away from this podcast, is we need to stop thinking about missions just in terms of geographic boundaries and start thinking about missions in terms of digital boundaries, because that's the country we need to be reaching with the gospel. I think that's really a critical thing.
Yeah, I think it's been such a huge culture shift just in terms of the paradigm of the local church, but also it's a massive leadership shift, because now more than ever, if any time there's been an opportunity for young adults to lead in the church, the local church, it's right now. I mean, these are the apostles, the digital apostles that we need to kind of step in and contribute and to lead high and to lead well. They don't need to be relegated to some, small section of the church. Let them come to the elders meetings, let them come to the deacon boards, let them be a part of the pastoral sort of planning and strategy sessions, because they're thinking and they're seeing and they're speaking in ways that we can't, at least people my age,
right?
That's not native to us. They're natives. You said that. So I think it's been such a huge leadership shift as well. And I think that's a different aspect of this era that we need to consider as well.
Well, pastors have always suffered from myopia in the sense that they only think about who they see in that congregation. But your communication team sees way beyond the walls of the church. And while you may be reaching 200, 500, 1,000 people, whatever, even 75 people in your church, your communication team could be amplifying your message to hundreds of thousands beyond the walls of the church. So pastors are starting to really understand that for the first time, I think, and really getting a handle on just how important. I mean, after all, Paul, the apostle Paul, used the technology of his day, which was letters, to build the foundation of the early church. And then along, about 1500, Martin Luther came in and used the technology of his day, which was the printing press, to become the most famous published author in the world and literally change publishing completely. And so for us today to not use technology to share the gospel, obviously there's a lot of negatives about social media. There's a lot of things to be careful of, but at the same time, not to use it as a tool, I think it's just really quite foolish.
Yeah. So how do we guard against, because we've seen it a lot lately, pastors who their brand is bigger than the church. And we've seen pastors who have built substantial social media followings and become sort of culturally famous, and Christian celebrityism is among us. We got to acknowledge that it's here, come crashing down.
Yeah.
So within that context, how do we set a guard up on that?
Well, I think you're exactly right. And it's a really a pride issue. And I think so many pastors tend to get to a place where they're surrounded by a team of yes men. Believe me, I've worked for both over the years. I've had the opportunity to engage with both. And I know people that are remarkably influential that could be a celebrity pastor, but they just refuse to be. You look at guys like Jack Hayford, who was my pastor for many, many years here in Los Angeles. He was Jack. He was just Pastor Jack. Everybody knew him as Jack. He had no ego. He had no pride. And yet he was one of the most influential pastors in America. Jack Graham at Prestonwood Baptist Church is the same way today. I just find that there are some people that surround themselves with a team that they're all equals. It's funny. I've written a blog post about this just recently that I get, a lot of cases like you talk about Ravi Zacharias, the great tragedy that happened in his ministry just recently. One of the issues there is the team that surrounds a leader like that. They get a salary. They're getting, they're making a living. This is the way they make their living. They also get a lot of prestige of being in the inner circle of a leader. So I get they're very hesitant to pull the plug on somebody, or even when they see something happening that they should report, they're hesitant to do it. And in many cases, the leadership team are made up of people that got saved at this person's ministry, or they got their marriage put back together, or they had their, something significant in their life happened because of that pastor or leader. So I see why it's hard to do it. That's why I think pastors have to be incredibly careful to surround themselves with people that they respect, who are willing to really talk to them and tell them the truth. You don't have to be brutal about it. But I think telling a pastor, hey, for whatever reason, I'm not a pastor, but my creative team here at Cooke Media Group, the Lord has seen fit to surround me with people that are happy to tell me I'm an idiot. They're happy to tell me my ideas are stupid and won't work. So, and I'm thrilled for that. I love that. And I think pastors just have to be more intentional about making sure they're surrounded by people they respect and they listen to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then the conversation kind of shifts a little bit here. So we're dabbling into the social media side, which is obviously a medium that's not going anywhere anytime soon. It keeps changing faces a little bit, right?
Right.
But it's not going anywhere, obviously. So the next question is, how much time do we invest? How much money do we invest in order for us to create something that is of quality or worthy of that investment, right? Because we've also seen the flip side where it's not just about getting on a Facebook page and quoting, throwing up your Bible verses and all that. That's not really effective either.
Right.
So there's a rhythm and sort of a balance to this conversation about social media that we haven't quite figured out yet, I think. So how are you helping leaders and pastors sort of navigate that as well?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I think that the key thing is being the same person on social media that you are in real life. We've heard terms like authenticity,
Right.
being real, that kind of stuff. I think that's an important issue. I often say that if I see another pastor post, "Today is the day the Lord hath made, let us rejoice and be glad in it," I'll blow my brains out. I love scripture, but that's not what social media is about. Social media is about sharing your heart with people. It's about being real with people, having conversations online. And we forget that social media is social. So often pastors will post something and then just walk away. And they don't respond to the people who respond to them. I had a pastor in North Carolina call me just recently and say, "I've never, ever responded to somebody." He said, "Even though you've told me to, I've never responded to people on my social media feeds." And he said, "A woman responded to something I posted on Facebook the other day, and I felt led to just talk to her. And so I engaged with her, and she had a theological question. I answered it." And he said, "Lo and behold, the next Sunday she came to church." And he said, "Then lo and behold, at the end of the service, she came forward and accepted Christ." And he said, "Then lo and behold, on Monday, I got a call that the woman had been killed in a car accident." He said, "It sounds cheesy just to say it." He said, "It sounds kind of over spiritualizing, but the truth is, what if I had not engaged with that woman on social media? What if we'd not started that conversation? What could have happened?" So that's kind of an extreme situation, but I've seen over and over that pastors who are willing to engage with the people that talk to them. I mean, obviously there are nuts out there, there are trolls out there. I get that. You don't want to waste your whole life doing this. But I think if you really post with the intention of checking occasionally what people say, how they're responding to your post, re-engage with them, you could just start some amazing conversations happening and really change the perception of people toward the church.
Yeah. You mentioned trolls, and they are out there.
All right.
And we've got some friends have been on the show who have taken some really bad beatings on social media. We won't name names of who.
That means they're accomplishing something. So
that's the thing. Like, so in being authentic, you're gonna have people who disagree. I like to say that I'm not everybody's cup of coffee, but some people like tea. So
right.
So how do we deal with those who are going to be haters and trolls?
I certainly get my share. And I've discovered this for all you pastors that are listening, that every church in America that's really accomplishing something great has a disgruntled ex-employee or an ex-church member who's decided to create a Facebook page or a blog for the express purpose of criticizing that church. I know one church out here in the West that has a guy that he just did something, ticked him off about the church, and he created a blog, and every Sunday, every week, he posts something negative about the church. And so that's going to happen. But here's my thing. I divided it into a couple different levels. Number one, make sure that what they're saying is really a criticism. Sometimes it can be just a misunderstanding. Sometimes they don't really understand what you're trying to do or what you said, and they're asking a question, and it may seem a little bit hostile, but it's really not. So I take a step back and take a breath. Particularly Twitter is so easy to just nail somebody just at the push of a button. And I have to just take a deep breath, step back, and make sure I understand what they're saying. And if I can engage with them, I will, and maybe change their heart. If they're being a really ugly critic, sometimes taking them offline helps. Very, very often I advise churches, have your social media person, follow that person, engage with them, give them their phone number and say, "Hey, call me and we'll take care of this. We want to help you solve your problem." And that immediately takes the criticism offline, so people aren't seeing it. So that's why. But the other thing is, if it's an unrepentant troll, if it's a troll that's just a jerk, don't be afraid to block. So often as Christians, we feel like, well, we shouldn't block people. We shouldn't eliminate those people from the conversation. Let me tell you something. If they're just an unrepentant jerk, block them. It does not help. In the same way of a chat room, of a church service, a live stream service, if somebody's being a jerk, absolutely block them, because that's distracting. One other thing I would say about engaging with trolls is when I get really ugly criticism sometimes, I'll just check that person's followers. How many people are following him? So Twitter's a good example. If I had a guy ripped into me the other day about something, so I checked his followers and he had 7 people following him. That's probably his family. So if I responded to him, that means I would expose my 37,000 followers to that guy. I don't want to do that. That would help. That would only help him. So I just don't respond at all. And that probably makes him madder than ever. But by not responding, you're not sharing this guy's email address or his Twitter handle with all your followers. So just be careful in whether you engage, no matter how mad it may make you. I did a post recently that I had a critic, and I stepped back and took a breath. And while I did, a bunch of my followers went after this guy. So you don't even have to engage with a lot of critics. So I would just advise pastors and leaders, remember, whatever you put online never goes away.
Right.
Yeah.
Never goes away. I even say with emails, when you hit that send button, you have lost control of that email. And that person you're sending it to today may be your friend. Tomorrow, he may not be your friend, and he has that email. So I'm just very cautious about what I say online. And my accountant really taught me this, because I'd ask my accountant financial questions about our company or about me personally. And he'd always respond email with, give me a call. Just give me a call. We'll talk about it. Never talks about those things online, because you just can't control where that ends up.
That's interesting. And I think what it speaks to again is a need for a level of discernment and a need for a level of maturity in our faith, right? That is required when we take risks. We're all called to a life by the Spirit. We're not called to a life of safety. We're not called to a life of not engaging the world, right? And so when we actually do those things, there's going to be some of these conflicts and these tensions that arise. But I think what you're speaking about is that level of maturity and that level of discernment that's required for us in order to actually become the light and the salt that Jesus is calling us to be.
It's true. And it's tough in today's culture. I mean, we see so many things that are not right. We see so many things that are not biblical. And, the culture in so many ways is going south quickly. And we want to say something about it. We want to say something, but I just have to be really cautious of that. What am I, if something I say, I'm just going to start a stupid argument, what's the point of that? So I try to take a little higher level view whenever I can. Now, I will say that whatever I say about social media, completely disregard when it comes to my Instagram account. I just have fun with Instagram. So I post a lot of crazy stuff there. And, so yeah, that's a little different.
So maybe for leaders who are sort of, you say dip the toe in or trying to get involved, the different platforms, what kind of advice can you give on how to navigate the different platforms? Because you can't just, it's not a one size fits all. Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, while Facebook owns Instagram, and they're not the same thing. They don't operate on the same algorithm. They're completely different. What are the wins? What are some ways to kind of early win, get connected, and offer something more than a soundbite?
Well, first of all, understand that they're different audiences. I find that on Twitter, you're largely getting leaders. You get a lot of pastors on Twitter. You get a lot of CEOs, a lot of news people. There's a lot of news feeds on Twitter, a lot of academics. There's more leadership oriented stuff on Twitter than anywhere else I've seen. Instagram is a lot hipper, younger crowd. It's very visual, so I really like it. I can tend to graduate toward Instagram. Facebook is a little more friends and family oriented. You'll still get a lot of different people on there, but I've discovered it's more friendly, family kind of issues, things like that. So starting out knowing who your audience is matters. So you're not posting the same thing. I rarely will post the same thing across all platforms. And the other thing I would say is, don't feel like you have to do everything. Pick 1 or 2 or maybe 3 at the most, and really focus on them. TikTok is really blowing up, but it's just not something that I have a great interest for. It just, I feel like that's a bridge too far. I'm not going to go there. My son-in-law is an actor here in Hollywood, and he's got a great TikTok following, but that's just not for me. So I'm focusing on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, although I have to say I hate Facebook with every fiber of my being, but that's just the way it operates. But I just think knowing the audience is absolutely critical, and then focusing what you want to do and what you want to accomplish. A lot of it is, what has God called you to do with your life? What is your personal brand, if you will? What do you want people to think of when they think of you? How do you want to be known? One of the things that got me into this was when I was a kid, back in the 50s and 60s was during a time of pastors were doing a lot of gimmicks. You know, we had a pastor in our neighborhood that sat on a pole for a week until Sunday school numbers got up. Another pastor said if we could get enough people show up in church one Sunday, he'd shave his head. And I would go to school and kids would say, Phil, why do these pastors do such stupid things? And I realized the perception of the church really does matter. People are they're not going to engage with the gospel if we're not people they want to be like. And so I think understanding what your perception is as you share the gospel is really kind of important. And that's because that's going to, Rodney Stark, the sociologist at Baylor, has said that the single greatest reason people convert is because they want to be like those people. So my big question is, are we living the kind of life that makes the culture look at us and think, I want to be like those people. I like what they post. That's amazing. Their families are incredible. Their lives are amazing. I want to be like that. I'll tell you, if that would happen, then we'd have a revival in this country.
That'd be amazing.
So how much of the behind the scenes then because Instagram especially, I feel like, is very all the good times.
Yeah.
So how much do we let people see of the authentic bad times if we're trying to get them to live this way?
I tell leaders that the single greatest reason people follow you on social media is they want to know what your life is like. Even if you have a small church, even if your church is 50, 75, 150 people, chances are someone just can't call you out of the blue and say, Pastor, I'd like to meet you at Starbucks. You're busy. You're doing a lot of things. You can't always do that. Particularly if it's a larger church, it's impossible. But through social media, they can get a glimpse of what your life is like. I tell pastors, I'd love you to share on social media right before you walk out on stage to do the funeral of somebody you loved and respected for many years in the church. What are the thoughts going through your mind? Just be real. Late at night when you're struggling with that message and you can't get it all together, share that on social media. People love to hear those inside stories about what you're struggling with. I find that when I'm doing stuff on a shoot, like a film shoot or something, and I just do off the cuff things, they're the biggest responded to posts I can do. I did a thing with Pastor Greg Laurie at Harvest here in California recently, where he wanted to do a television program to encourage guys to share their faith with other guys. And so he has a Mustang, a replica of that Bullitt Mustang that Steve McQueen drove in that movie back in the 60s. And so we tricked it out with cameras and we set it all up, and we had a giant drone following it up PCH and had a follow truck with a camera in it. And while we were rigging the car, he just pulled out his phone and just did a little Instagram video and said, hey, I'm here with Phil Cooke. We're rigging out my Mustang to have a conversation with a friend of mine about how to share faith with other guys. Let me tell you, that went through the roof. So little moments like that are intimate insider moments that give people a glimpse of your life that they normally wouldn't see. I'll tell you, that's popular stuff.
Yeah. So I think this is kind of leading well into a conversation that I have on campus quite often. Number one, it's vocation related, right? Discovering their brand.
Yep.
Story brand or whatever. A lot of people are reading Story Brand and getting connected to Story Brand and trying to figure that out. Maybe that's a different conversation, but the point is, I think what each one of the students that I'm coming into contact with, they're all searching, if I could boil it down to one word, is this conversation of significance. And so when we start talking about social media and the drive that pushes it there, one of the big qualifying sort of false realities is that creates significance for them because of the number of followers or whatever. And though it could create some significance. So how are we kind of helping young adults, or how should we be helping young adults better navigate this conversation of being influential and being an influencer at the same time? Like where's the good rhythm in that?
Well, it's a perennial question, really, about how far we go. Where do we draw that line between what we're willing to do to become famous, if you will, or get noticed or be what we think is significant? One of the things I've felt like is I can have influence with my social media, but it's not the end all and be all for me. I'm writing books, I'm producing television programs and films and things like that. So I have to really curb my appetite for social media enough to do enough deep work and focus on what I really need to do. Now, if somebody feels led that they can get millions of followers and make a living from social media, that's a different story, but that's so incredibly rare. We've actually worked with a couple influencers out there who are Christians that do get remarkable numbers. And I just think that's a great thing. If you feel called to do it, that's great. But for most of us, I could talk about my books on social media. I can talk about my films on social media. I can talk about my ideas about culture on social media. My blog, I often talk about things I've written on my blog on social media. And it's more of a tool for sharing with a bigger audience. It just does. I have to say, it amazes me that I travel around the world. I've produced programs in about 70 countries around the world, and I'm always on a plane. And no matter where I go, I meet people that know me because of my social media feed. And that's just a remarkable thing. And so I'm just able to start interesting conversations with people all over the world because of social media. So I value it, but I don't look at it as the end all be all of everything. That probably didn't answer your question. That was probably a lousy answer, but
I mean, it helps. But in maturity, you can say that as a 21, 22-year-old, they don't have a book, they don't have a blog, they don't have television shows. That is the end all be all measure. So then maybe how do you define influence for yourself, Phil?
Helping Christians not suck at the media. If I can do that, I will die a happy man.
You're the guy we need to talk to. That's what.
Man, if I can do that, I'll die a happy man. And the truth is that there's a lot of work to be done. I'll be busy for the rest of my life, I'm afraid.
So is influence then defined by connecting it to purpose and calling?
I think it can. You guys are throwing some hard stuff at me here. I think it can. I think, well, for me, everything is connected to purpose and calling. Everything. My books are, my films, my TV programs, everything I do is connected to my purpose and calling. And that's the important thing. One of the things worth saying, particularly to leaders, excuse me, is one of the important things we're saying is that think of a narrow niche or niche, however you want to say it. You're not trying to address everything out there. For instance, with me, my whole life is about the intersection of faith, media, and culture. On my blog, I don't talk about recipe, or my social media, I don't talk about recipes. I don't talk about politics. I don't talk about football. I talk about the intersection of faith, media, and politics. And if you want to break through on social media, that's the way to do it. Find that niche where you can be the best in the world at. And the smaller, the more narrow, the better. The illustration I often use is the woman who's won the most Grammy Awards in history is not Aretha Franklin or Barbara Streisand or Celine Dion or Beyonce. The woman who by far has won the most Grammy Awards in history is Alison Krauss, the bluegrass player, because she just competes in this little narrow little niche. And she, as a result, she's so good, she walks away with the Grammys. She just takes all those Grammys in the bluegrass category every single year. And as a result, she dominates. Now, that's made her so famous that now she recorded a rock album with Robert Plant years ago. I've heard she's thinking about a classical album. She could do anything she wants now because she's so famous. So in a likewise scenario, I tell directors or producers coming to Hollywood, don't try to compete with every director in Hollywood. Let's find a certain niche. Maybe it's a certain genre of film, a certain budget level, a certain size film. You could compete in there and get known and become famous. That's the way you actually get on the radar and get noticed by people. So it's not about trying to be everything to everybody on social media. It's much more be extraordinary. I wrote a book years ago called One Big Thing, Discovering What You Were Born to Do. And that's the theme of that, but that came out before social media, but that's still relevant today because discover that one big thing you're amazing at that God's called you to accomplish that could change the world. And that's the way to start.
So more hard questions. Do you think the small niche can work in local church? Like by aiming small at maybe traffic?
Absolutely. The Great Commission is interesting to me. We're called to reach the world with the gospel, but the truth is your church is not going to reach everybody. Every pastor thinks he's going to reach everybody, but it's not true. I say, let's find the low hanging fruit. Let's find the people that respond to your message in your geographical community, that reflect the culture and the makeup of your church. Let's go after those people with a vengeance. And I'll tell you something, if every church in the world did that, we would win the world. We would fulfill the Great Commission. But because we're scattered, we're trying to reach everybody. We're not hardly reaching anybody. So I say, be who you are. I was at a church recently that they're still, probably a lot of your listeners are doing this. They're still doing the contemporary service and, or the traditional service at 9 a.m. and then they do a completely different contemporary service at 11. You know what? It's time to throw that out. It's time to be who you are. Figure out who you are as a church and be amazing at who you are instead of being average at something else.
What is
that'll make some people mad.
Yeah.
Thanks.
What is it then that drives us? Because it seems like to me, so on a cognitive scale, it seems like to me it's 10 times harder to be all things to all people, right? To try to win everybody or try to fit every model or mold or whatever, than it is to do the hard work, But why are we so hesitant in doing the hard work to actually find out what our niche is or what that one big thing for us is? What's the hesitancy there?
That's a great question. And I think people are good people and they want to do the right thing, and they read the Great Commission and they feel like we should try to do it. Let me give you an example from Jack Hayford, my pastor for many years. I've heard Jack preach probably 600, 800, 1,000 sermons. I mean, literally on everything you can possibly imagine: forgiveness, grace, family issues, all kind of stuff over the years. But if you cut Jack, he will bleed worship. I mean, he's written 100 worship songs. He's written 5 books on worship. For 27 or 30 years, when he pastored Church on the Way here in Los Angeles, he not only was the pastor, he led the worship. He was the worship leader.
Wow.
That's his thing. So he views everything in the world through the lens of worship. So it doesn't matter if he's preaching on forgiveness, if he's preaching on financial issues, if he's preaching on judgment, whatever he's preaching on, he does it through the lens of worship. And I'll tell you something, that put Jack on the map. That gave him a different perspective than anybody else in the world had. And that's what got Jack noticed. So I just really believe for pastors to figure out that lens, what is that thing you view the world through? If you can do that and then do whatever you're called to preach on, doesn't mean you have to preach on fewer subjects, but you do it through this common lens that really is integral to who you are. I think that would change everything for you. I don't know if that answered the question or made sense, but I've seen it happen in the lives of so many leaders.
I think it's exceptionally freeing, because I think sometimes we're always trying to be all things to all people, or we're trying to be somebody else. So I think that's exceptionally freeing for leaders to go, hey, this is who I am, and I'm going to go reach people like this and like me, and I'm going to find leaders to come alongside me that think and feel like this. And I think there is a win in that. I think there's liberty in that. And I think probably you're right. We would see explosion in churches reaching more people because we're just being who God's called us to be.
Boy, that you said it much better than me. I think that's exactly. And when I look at the most effective churches in America, that's what they're doing. That's exactly what they're doing. They have the leader from the leadership team on down. They are focused, and that really does matter.
Yeah, I get that.
I mean, that's good.
Even being at Saddleback all those years. I mean, Rick is you cut Rick open, he's going to bleed purpose. Right? I mean, every message, every sermon, every PD conference that I ever attended kind of filtered through those 5 purposes of life. And
I think it's the same, like Andy Stanley, it's leadership. Louis Giglio, it's next generation, and you can go on and on the list. It's huge in them.
Yeah. And you can go way past. Billy Graham was salvation. Oral Roberts was healing. Joel Osteen is hope. I mean, you could just whatever. Yeah. The guys that have really nailed it are guys that have figured out what that is, whether you like them or not, or whether you follow them or not. These are people that have really figured out what that lens is, and they do everything through that.
That's awesome. That's good.
So here's a question. I know we're getting close to time, and we want to honor that, but I know you two kind of help a lot of leaders, not only in terms of ministry and other pastors and churches, but you help a lot of other leaders who are also not in that industry, right? So a lot of leaders in different. So in your experience, what are some of those maybe 1, 2, 3 high view steps that people can take, leaders can take, to not only maybe discover who they are, but to be okay with who they are?
I like that addition, to be okay with who you are. That's really true. Let me give you a couple quick thoughts. Excuse me. One of them would be sometimes it's very hard to figure out what that one big thing is for us. It's real hard, but the rest of the world sees it quite often. I mean, for instance, remember at high school, when we do a high school homecoming, when we were on the homecoming committee at high school, we'd sit around a table and say, well, Bob, you're good with numbers. Why don't you do the budget? Susan, you're really creative. Why don't you come up with a theme? Sam, you're amazing in front of people. Why don't you be the host? Other people see what we're naturally gifted for, sometimes before us. So number one, I encourage people, ask your friends, people that would be brutally honest with you. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What do I seem to be really good at? The second thing to think about is what comes easy for you. Doesn't mean you can't improve. Doesn't mean you don't work hard at it. But I early in my career, I directed a lot of sports television for the NCAA and football, basketball, boxing, all kind of stuff. And I would just talk to these athletes and they'd say, Phil, I was just the guy in the neighborhood that could catch the ball. Nobody else could. Or I was always the fastest kid on my street. It just things that came easy for them were what they built their career on. And for me, it's writing. I just love writing. I can certainly improve. I'm always studying it and trying to be better, but I can't not write. I just live to write. So I learned early on, that's my thing. So finding that thing that comes relatively easy for you is really, really critical because, why keep struggling? Don't bang your head against the wall, find out what works for you and be amazing at that. And, one other thing I would just say is constantly be learning and growing. I read a quote the other day by Michelangelo at the peak of his career, probably the greatest artist of all time, said, I'm still learning. And I think if he could say that, I could still say that. And I think one of the reasons we fail as Christians in the culture today is we're just not really paying attention to what's going on out there. I want to read stuff that I don't agree with. I want to see things I don't agree with. I want to see what's going on out there in the world so I can formulate a better response. And so very often we get in this bubble. One of the sad things about our world today is we have Christian television, Christian radio, Christian publishing. We have Christian everything. And it's easy to get stuck in the bubble. And I think there's a place for Christian television and Christian radio and Christian publishing. That's fine. But I don't want to get stuck in that bubble. I'm constantly wanting to step out and see what the rest of the world looks like. And when I'm working on a film set here in Hollywood, that's not a Christian project, it gives me such insight into what's going on, how people think, how it works. So I would just encourage people, always be aware of what's happening in the world. Never, never, never stop learning.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Phil, this has been enjoyable to say the least. We have one final question that we ask every one of our guests. I think you mentioned you were an ORU grad, right? Golden Eagles?
Yeah, boy.
Correct?
Yes,
sir.
Talk
about that after the show. I got some connections. Oh, it's good. It's good. I got connections out there. But we ask every guest this one same final question. What is one lesson you learned in college that did not take place in the classroom?
The lesson I learned in college that didn't happen in my classroom was don't wait, seize the moment. I had a film professor at ORU that said, look, Phil, you just become the best director you could be, the best producer you could be, and Hollywood will beat a path to your door. Well, he was an idiot. He had no clue. Once I got out here, I learned, oh my gosh, it is fighting tooth and nail, and you have to seize the moment. I owned a commercial company a number of years ago that did Super Bowl commercials, and we did some super high-end commercials. And in that world, we have something called spec reels. And it's simply that when a young director is trying to break into the advertising world, he goes out and produces his own commercials. They could be Nike commercials or Under Armour commercials or Starbucks, whatever, because the company's never going to use them. They're just for you to demonstrate your ability. But you raise the money, you shoot the spots, you edit them together, and they're designed to show off your ability. But you have to take the initiative and do it. You have to raise the money. You have to find the crew, get the equipment, and do it. I wish early on I had really seized that moment and, run up the credit card bill, taken out a second mortgage, leaned on my relatives to help me get enough money to start making some projects I could have been really proud of and shown to the world. Because you know what? Ideas are great. I'm glad you're thinking about that movie or thinking about writing that book or thinking about starting the church or launching the ministry. But the truth is, people want to see something you've accomplished. So get out there, seize the moment. Doesn't matter. Doesn't have to be pretty. My friend Erwin McManus calls it raw beauty. It may have a lot of mistakes, may have a lot of screw ups, but at least you've accomplished something and people notice that. So that would be my encouragement for people.
Great.
That's
a great answer.
Yeah, great answer. And yeah, Erwin is on our list of people to get on the show.
If Erwin's listening,
he's awesome.
He is, but we'd like to have him as a guest.
I'll give him a call. I'll lean on him for you.
Okay, that'd be great.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Phil, man, it has been such a joy, such an honor to have the conversation with you. And thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us. And I know our listeners are going to be very encouraged and very inspired and even challenged to really kind of think through.
Yeah, super insightful stuff.
Yeah, super insightful.
Well, thank you. And you guys, it was very insightful questions. I don't often get asked such good questions. It's still making me think a little bit. So
we can maybe come back to that. But as I always say here on the Leadership Drips, Phil, you have a seat at the table with us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Leadership Drip. If something from this episode helped you lead better, then share it on your social media and tag us. If we see it, we may share it to our channels. We appreciate you taking time to join us. And remember, you always have a seat at the table.